Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture about drugs. Today we're going to talk about marijuana. And this is an especially interesting drug to talk about from a sociological point of view because we are constantly changing our minds about whether it's good or bad or medicinal or criminal. So I'm very excited to tell you about all of the weird laws that we have and how we have thought about marijuana over the course of history. So let's start with our favorite question: what is it? And the answer for this is a little bit complicated. So typically, when we talk about marijuana, what we're talking about are the leaves and especially the flowers of the cannabis plant. There are a lot of different ways to consume marijuana these days, and we'll talk about that. But for the most part, we're talking about a very old plant that humans have used for thousands of years, and specifically, we're talking about the dried leaves and stems and flowers of that plant. Where it starts to get complicated is in regard to the difference between the cannabis plant and the hemp plant. So essentially, they're the same plant, they're from the same plant family, but the hemp plant grows a little bit differently. There's a lot more leaves, and it has a very small amount of THC, which we'll talk about in a second. The cannabis plant, on the other hand, tends to grow kind of big and fat, and it has really big flowers. This is the one that has a lot of THC, depending on the plant, and that's why we classify them differently. So historically, hemp has been a very popular plant. A lot of the founding fathers in America planted hemp. Georgia's main cash crop used to be hemp, and it's often used for paper and for fabric and for rope. And it's gone sort of out of fashion because of its correlation with the marijuana plant, but it's starting to sort of come back into fashion. If you've been to stores lately, you've probably seen like hemp moisturizers and things like that. One of the main differences between hemp and cannabis is the presence of certain psychoactive chemicals. So in cannabis, we have what's called CBD, and that's cannabinol. And this has a lot of physical effects. People typically take it for medical reasons, including anxiety and sleep disorders and arthritis. It helps with inflammation. Whereas the cannabis plant, and again, marijuana, contains tetrahydrocannabinol, and you don't necessarily need to know that, but that's what we all call THC. And THC is the one that activates in your brain, the one that causes feelings of euphoria, slowness, a sort of haziness. This is what people are talking about when they say that they're high. So the difference between the two is that we consider one to be dangerous and the other not. This is one of the reasons that the marijuana plant itself was classified as a drug instead of as like a medicinal plant. So when you hear people talking about CBD, they're talking about usually a completely legal, very low amount of active compound. But when you hear people talk about THC, they're talking about an active presence of the drug in the thing that they're consuming. So that's the main difference between the two. Hemp is legal, CBD is legal in most everywhere at this point, especially Georgia, whereas THC is often not legal, and it has been considered throughout history dangerous and then sometimes not dangerous. That's what we'll talk about today. One of the things that makes the cannabis plant so interesting sociologically is its long, long history. Humans have known about this plant for thousands and thousands of years, and we are regularly uncovering sites that show that it was used in ceremonial purposes. They just recently found a new thing in India that contained an almost 10,000-year-old cannabis plant, so we know that it's existed for a really long time. If we look at this map, we can see that in all likelihood it originated there in what we would consider now to be northern India and sort of spread from there. So we have records of it spreading as early as 1000 BC, and it didn't necessarily make its way to North America until about the 1600s. Once it did make its way to North America, we began farming it. Again, we started with hemp and then gradually sort of worked our way into the marijuana side of the cannabis plant. But the fact that the plant has existed for so long and been used by so many cultures is one of the most interesting things about it. Because most of the other drugs that we talk about are not nearly that old, and they certainly aren't nearly that historically popular. Our next question, of course, is what is it used for? And the answer here is twofold. For one thing, when we're talking about hemp, again, it's mostly used for fiber, but definitely for a little bit of CBD. When we're talking about cannabis, on the other hand, we have two main uses, and one is recreational, which is just straight up to get high, and the other is medicinal, which is to treat certain, especially inflammatory and nausea and hunger issues. So let's first deal with how we use it medicinally. So when we ask, is it medicinal for this certain plant, the answer is yes. However, it does depend very much on where you are and when you are. So first, let's look at a map. In this map, we can see which states in the United States have legal marijuana. This is something that's been changing very rapidly over the course of the last 10 or so years. But as you can see here, there does tend to be a geographical element. On the West Coast, it tends to be relatively popular in terms of legal use for medical reasons, whereas on the East Coast, and especially in the Southeast Bible Belt, it is not. In regard to how people tend to use it for medicinal reasons, I've made a series of beautiful lists for you, and to avoid the wall of text, I just wanted to talk about a couple. So if we look at this list, one of the things that we can see is that you can use it for a huge variety of conditions. Some of them are very serious. In some states that have medical marijuana, especially for instance in Georgia, you have to prove that you have a very serious disease and that you need this for pain control or nausea control. So for people with things like cancer and Alzheimer's and Crohn's disease, they can get medical marijuana prescriptions. In other states, the prescriptions for medical marijuana are much more liberal. In some states, you can say that you have anxiety or PMS or headaches, and the doctor's like, sure, and they'll go ahead and give you a prescription. So we know that it does have medicinal uses, but depending on where you are and when you are, sometimes we think you can use it for practically everything, and sometimes we think you can only use it if you have something very specific. One thing that's changing really rapidly is the idea that people might be able to use medicinal marijuana in place of harder drugs. So one of the things that we've been seeing in certain states around the United States, of course, is that people are replacing hydrocodone and other really strong opiates with marijuana to treat their pain. This is something that's been, again, evolving super rapidly. We've only really had these heavy opiates for a few years, but we're starting to see a lot of studies involving whether you can replace a very dangerous addictive drug with a less dangerous, less addictive drug. So this is something that conspiracy theorists will tell you the pharma companies are trying to keep under wraps. Maybe they are, I don't know. But this is something that's really interesting and very much on the forefront of the uses for medical marijuana. Our next question is, how is it used? And this one gets complicated. Traditionally, it has been used by drying the flower, usually, and then smoking it. However, people have gotten pretty complex with this. So they have invented a lot of other ways to consume marijuana and cannabis. You can cook with it, you can turn it into lotions, you can turn it into tinctures, you can use other chemicals to extract the most important chemical, THC, and then turn it into all sorts of bizarre and dangerous products. So the way that we use it is mostly determined by the purpose for which you're using it. Are you using it recreationally or are you using it medicinally? So the form of cannabis that you consume is very often dictated by the reason that you're consuming it. Our next question is, who uses this drug? And the answer is Snoop Dogg. Okay, I'm just kidding. The truth is that the answer is much more complicated now than it ever has been. So for the last few decades, we've thought of marijuana as a drug for a particular subset of society, specifically the sort of burnouts. But it's increasingly socially acceptable, especially as people begin to use it for medicinal reasons. So the amount of Americans who are using marijuana is a little bit difficult to track because, of course, we don't have any data from before it was legal because no one wanted to tell us that. But we do have some interesting data that goes back for the last couple years. So let's look at some graphs. In our first graph, we are measuring the percentage of Americans who use marijuana regularly. And it's important to keep in mind that this graph is only tracking use since the legalization, especially in regard to legalization of recreational use. So you can see that it holds pretty steady. Usually between 10 and 12% of Americans are regularly using marijuana. This next graph does come from a slightly biased source. NORML is an organization that is pro-legalization, so it is always important to consider the source of your information. But in this graph, we're measuring people who have ever used marijuana. Not necessarily people who use it regularly, but people who have ever tried it. And one of the things that's interesting about this graph is that you can see that there's a lot of variation in regard to race. So, nearly half of white people have tried it. Similarly, nearly half of mixed race people have tried it, and Native American people. But there's a wide disparity after that. A lot of Asian people, for instance, have never tried it. A lot of Hispanic people have never tried it. So the extent to which you have been offered the opportunity to try marijuana can have a lot to do with your ethnic identity, and the extent to which you regularly use it also can. For instance, let's look at this next graph. This is whether people have used marijuana over the course of the past year, and this one is broken down solely into black and white, but I wanted to show it to you because this information is going to become relevant later. Specifically, this information is going to become relevant when we look at who gets arrested for using it. So what we can see very clearly in this graph is that white people are more likely to use marijuana than black people. This is true longitudinally. It's getting, bigger some years and smaller some years. But the important thing to remember about this graph is that consistently the majority of marijuana users are white. In this graph, we're measuring age. So here we're looking at how early people start to use marijuana, and very specifically in this graph, we're looking at vaping. So previously in the semester, we talked about vaping in regards to tobacco and specifically nicotine, but it's also very popular in regard to THC. So here you can see that we're measuring 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, but we're also measuring 2017, 2018, and 2019. And what's really surprising about this graph is that there's a dramatic jump between how much people are smoking in 8th grade and how much they're smoking in 12th grade, for instance, which is predictable. But there's also a dramatic jump in how often people are vaping in the last couple of years. So we used to smoke it the old-fashioned way, and that used to be true for all age groups, but with the prevalence of vaping generally comes the prevalence of vaping THC specifically. So this is something that we're starting to see happening more commonly in younger people. In this graph, we are specifically measuring who is using recreational weed in 3 states. So this one isn't nationwide, but it is interesting because this is people who are legally able to access recreational marijuana. And what we see here is pretty predictable to the extent that more men smoke than women. One of the surprising things is that older people are buying it more often than younger people, which is kind of interesting. People with lower levels of education tend to be more popular in consumers. People with lower levels of education are more common consumers than people with bachelor's degrees or graduate degrees, which is also kind of interesting. This one goes contrary to what we saw with alcohol, but it does match what we saw with tobacco. You can also see that Democrats and independents are using it at roughly the same rate, but it's a little bit less common among Republicans. This probably has something to do with conservative values. And finally, you can see that it's a little bit more common in Oregon than it is in Colorado or Washington. So among people who are purchasing recreational marijuana, there are differences in regard to education and to race. This graph is only measuring gender. So according to this graph, which is the course from 2017, so it is a little bit old, it looks like about twice as many men as women are consuming marijuana. However, we do always have to keep in mind with any sort of survey regarding drug use that people lie to us. This can be especially true of people who are afraid that they'll get in trouble, and this is something that is very common in the training of women, the socialization, especially of young girls. So it's possible that women are using it the same rate as men, but they're not telling us, but it's also possible that men are using it twice the rate of women. One of the interesting things about who uses marijuana has to do with who we think uses it and who really uses it. So when you were younger, you probably went through some anti-drug programs, and they probably showed you pictures like this one. Here you can see a girl trying to choose between 2 possible dates, and what she's measuring is whether she thinks that they're likely to smoke marijuana, and therefore whether they're likely to make a good partner. So growing up, you probably heard a lot of messages about this, about people who use marijuana regularly having no job or having no prospects or having a low sense of responsibility. And what we're finding, especially as we legalize, is that this does not bear out. Ultimately, we find this is not the case. So let's look at a few more graphs. In this graph, we're measuring the extent to which college students use marijuana, and what you can see is that it's pretty steady. Nothing too exciting. They do note a 7% increase over the course of 5 years, but again, it's possible that those students were just not telling them because this graph comes from drugabuse.gov. We're pretty sure that people who are in college are using marijuana, especially vaping specifically, at a higher rate than their non-college peers. So once again, this sort of matches with the data that we saw in regard to alcohol. It's possible that this is a social situation thing, that people who are in college are just encountering marijuana more regularly than people who aren't. We aren't sure. We need some more studies to find out, but this is kind of interesting, the idea that people who are in college are using drugs at a higher level. Finally, we have a graph about why the people who use marijuana are using it. So in this graph, they're arguing that 48% of adults have tried it at some point in their lives, but in regard to why they use it, the majority use it for fun. Like with all drugs, often we just want to be intoxicated. However, we're starting to see an increase in people who are using it for medical reasons, and we're also seeing that a lot of people are using it for both. Why not have a drug that also helps your body and it's fun to do? So once again, in regard to who uses this drug, that's something that's changing very, very rapidly. We're starting to see a lot more use among older people. The boomers are kind of coming back around. And we are starting to see a lot of use among younger people, even though that's not something we recommend until your brain finishes developing. So who uses marijuana? More people than we thought. Our next question is, how much is consumed? And this is kind of difficult to track. I was trying to find information about how much by volume, and that was not readily available. I did find this graph, which suggests that in Washington alone, probably about 20,000 pounds a year are being produced, and that matches with another source I found, but it suggested that 22 million pounds are being produced. So once again, we run into the legal versus non-legal issue. So how much is being produced and consumed by volume? I don't know. A more relevant question might be, how much do we spend? This is a lot easier to track. However, we do have to keep in mind that we're going to measure two different things. One, how much do we spend on the drug? And two, how much do we spend on the war on that drug? So let's start with how much we spend on the drug itself. In this first map, what we're looking at is the average price of an ounce of high-quality marijuana broken down by states. The most important thing to remember here is that in the states where it is legal to purchase, it is a little bit cheaper. This is basically because anytime you buy something that is illegal, you have to pay a little bit of a premium for the danger that the person who is selling it incurs. As you'll notice, there is a difference depending on how much it costs per state, but it is important to remember that in the states where it's illegal, there is no set price. You can pretty much charge whatever you want, so long as people are willing to pay it. In this next graph, we're looking at cannabis sales, but this one is a projection. So this graph ranges from 2018 to 2023. In the years that we have already seen, you can tell that there's a steady progression. As marijuana becomes more legal medicinally, we think it might sort of flatten out, but as it becomes more legal recreationally, we think that prices and consumerism will only go up. So ultimately, we may end up with people spending up to $30 billion a year in the United States on marijuana. If we tax it, we can make so much money. The next question we have to address is how much we spend on trying to get people to not do this drug and how much we spend punishing them when we catch them doing it. This is where most of our money is going. So in this first graph, we're looking at a budget breakdown in regard to how much we spend on the war on drugs. This one is from 2018, but I'm sorry that I couldn't find more recent data. As you can see, we do spend a little bit of money on treatment and prevention, not quite half, approaching about 45%. But the rest of the money we tend to spend on punishing people that we caught. We spend a lot of money catching people in the first place, and then we spend a lot of money in the court system. So ultimately, we are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to catch people who are using and selling marijuana. In this next graph, we're looking at how much we spend on drug enforcement over the course of time. So even though we know that we're spending a great deal of money on this, what's interesting is that each year we spend a little bit more. This graph doesn't quite reach to modern day, of course, but I wanted to show it to you because it shows a pretty strong projection in terms of the increasing amount of money that we're willing to spend on something like this. The issue with the amount of money that we're spending, especially in regard to marijuana drug enforcement, is that most of the time we are punishing and catching people who have very small amounts. So this data is relatively old. In this graph, we're looking at 2010, but this data hasn't changed very much. It's just that this one was the best pictographic. And what we see here is that over half of all drug arrests were for marijuana, and the vast majority of those had a little tiny bit on them. So even though we're spending billions and billions and billions of dollars a year trying to get people to not do this drug, most of the time we are not catching the people who are the source, like the distributors. Most of the time we're just catching casual users. So one of the arguments in favor of legalization is that we could be spending this money elsewhere. So our next question is it harmful? And the answer is not really. Not really. Um, there is one notable exception, and that is that studies have shown that it can have a negative impact on developing brains. So many doctors recommend not smoking until adulthood, and specifically not consuming any marijuana while pregnant because it can impact the brain of the fetus. What's interesting about whether or not we consider marijuana to be harmful has to do with what we tell young people, specifically in anti-drug programs. So if you went through an anti-drug program in school, you probably saw a poster like this. I love this poster very much. But what happens when we show people posters like this is shown here in this next graph. What we're measuring in this graph is essentially the perceived risk of harm versus the actual usage. So in the top graph, we're looking at students who are grade 8 and grade 6, so that's relatively young, that's basically like 13 and below. In the second graph, we're looking at grade 10 and grade 12, so that gets up between ages 16 and 18. And what you can see is that among younger people, the perceived risk is very high, and the actual use is, of course, very low. This has a lot to do with our anti-drug programs. However, among older students, we see that the perceived risk drops and drops, and the use goes up. So essentially what's happening is that we tell young children that it's very dangerous, they perceive it to be very dangerous, but then they start to see people using it in their lives, they might see the effects of legalization in their town, and they start to realize that in fact it might not be that dangerous. So very often your perceived harm of the drug is what's really important in regard to how harmful you believe it to be, and that depends on what you were told. Perhaps a more compelling question is whether it's socially harmful. One of the things that is the most dangerous about marijuana, as they say, is being caught with it. We do know that it can have impacts on your social life. It can have impacts on your motivation and your desire to do things, the availability of jobs for you, especially if you're subject to drug tests. And we do find that regular users tend to have a slightly higher rates of depression and anxiety and hopelessness. But again, we're facing a chicken-egg issue. It's very possible that those people were feeling that in the first place and used marijuana. So the social harm can be very real. Most of the time when we show a picture of stoners, especially if we're trying to get children to be afraid, it looks something like this. There is a sort of line of thought that the more drugs you do, specifically marijuana, the less likely you are to be professionally successful. We're starting to see a little bit of a shift in that, but the perceived harm is still there. One of the most common things that you hear people say in regard to the harm that marijuana can do is that it's a gateway drug. And what this means is that it will be the first drug that you try on the way to trying several others. This has been, for many, many years, the strongest argument against marijuana. But one of the things that we're finding is that, in fact, it is not a gateway drug. If we look at this next graph, what we see is that marijuana is certainly there, but alcohol is more likely to be the first drug that people try and the most prevalent in their young lives. So does marijuana act as a gateway drug? Not really. It's much more likely that you'll start with tobacco or that you'll start with alcohol. The other thing to consider in regard to whether marijuana is harmful is whether it's harmful if your pets eat it. Ever since legalization, there's been a major uptick in regard to how many animals go to the emergency room because they ate their owner's stash. And the prevailing veterinary advice is don't feed it directly to your dogs, and certainly don't feed them any pot brownies. But we are seeing a huge surge in the amount of people who are giving CBD specifically to their dogs. So you might see on the market a lot of treats that contain CBD, a lot of like oils and tinctures. A lot of people are using it for arthritis or for anxiety in their dogs. So the argument basically is don't feed your animal THC, but maybe feed them CBD. One of the most important questions in regard to harm is whether a drug can kill you. And the answer with marijuana is no. No one has ever overdosed from marijuana. People have tried. But as far as we can tell, you can consume it as much as you want, and the worst thing that'll happen is that you'll take a really, really long nap. To be fair, Willie Nelson has pointed out that once he did see someone harmed by marijuana, and that is because an entire bale of it fell on him. So can you overdose and die? No. Can you get flattened by a significant amount of marijuana? Maybe. Our next question is this drug addictive? And with marijuana, this gets a little tricky, because the answer is technically, chemically, no. But that doesn't mean that it's not habit forming. So let's look at this picture graph for a little more information. One of the ways that we measure addiction, and specifically that we measure drug abuse, is whether or not a person is physically dependent upon the drug. And the truth with marijuana is no, you will not become physically dependent to the point where detoxing is dangerous for you. But you can become physically dependent, especially if you're using it medically in regard to loss of appetite or nausea or something like that. So is it physically addictive? Not really. You'll never die without it. But is it habitually addictive? Maybe. Especially for people who might be using it to calm anxiety or to dampen depression. Sometimes we see that people become what they might call psychologically addicted. In this graph, they're looking at the amount of people who do become addicted based on adults and teens, and this is a very scary graph, isn't it? Here you'll see that 9% of adults who try marijuana become addicted, and 17% of teens who try marijuana become addicted. But remember to focus on the bottom where it says that this graph is sponsored by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So is it addictive? I'm going to go ahead and say no. Certainly not in comparison to the rest of the drugs that we'll talk about this semester. However, is it habit forming? I will say yes. So like all other drugs, the key is always moderation. Our next question, of course, is who was addicted? And the answer, once again, is Snoop Dogg. I'm still kidding. The answer is, again, nobody. Once more, I do have to specify if you're using it medicinally, you can have negative side effects if you quit. But in regard to who is addicted based on sociological factors, the answer remains nobody. Our next question is probably the most interesting one in regard to this drug, which is it legal? And the answer is, it depends on when and where you are. So I've made a very brief little picture graph for us here to go over the 4 most important dates. Basically, marijuana was legal in America for years and years and years. It wasn't really until the 20s that we started to crack down, and then in 1937 it was federally banned. In 1970, it was added to the list of federally controlled substances, and very specifically, it was considered a Category 1, which is considered the most dangerous of all of the controlled substances. In 1996, however, it was legalized for medicinal use in California. And then in 2012, it was legalized for recreational use in Colorado and Washington. So in order to explain how marijuana became illegal, and specifically how it became a Schedule I drug, I want to back all the way up to the 70s and tell you about Harry Anslinger. So here is Mr. Anslinger, and here is one of the quotes that pretty perfectly exemplifies why he wanted to make this illegal. His argument, essentially, is that it's a sociological thing, that he finds that people who are undesirable, here very specifically people of color and also musicians, are using this drug to influence white women. This is very important sociologically. The argument here is not that these people are using this drug and harming themselves. The argument here is that these people are coming for our women. And this is a pretty typical thing that we see sociologically, this idea that there is a group of humans who are angelic and perfect and pure, and that they are being harmed by the drug, specifically that the drug is being forced upon them by worse people, and specifically that white women are not going to choose Harry Anslinger. Spoiler alert, no one wants to date Harry Anslinger. So what we end up seeing is that someone who is convinced that essentially the brown people are coming to get him and also the women don't want him is convinced that how he can fix it is by making a drug illegal. So basically, Harry Anslinger had a lot of power. He was one of the people who finalized all of the really major federal drug laws, and he was also pretty tight with Richard Nixon. What I'm about to show you from Richard Nixon likely won't surprise you. Here again, we have a wall of text, but I think this is another excellent example of the way that our social prejudices impact what we believe about drug use. So Nixon said, "You know, it's a funny thing. Every one of the bastards out there for legalizing marijuana are Jewish." What? And he also claimed that it was because they were all psychiatrists, which maybe Nixon needed a little more psychiatry. But once again, we're seeing that very often the laws that we make about drugs are not about the drugs themselves. They're about the people that we believe to be using the drug. And marijuana is a perfect example of that. We became afraid of it because we were afraid of the people that we thought were using it. And because these two men, especially, were so afraid of the people that were using this drug, they thought that the best way to control them was to make the drug illegal. The fallout from these two men deciding that this drug was so dangerous was epic. So we started with a lot of social programs designed to get children to not use drugs. Here we see Nancy Reagan with her very famous Just Say No campaign, and a bumper sticker from DARE. Ironically, we find that children who went through the DARE program are actually more likely to do drugs than children who didn't. So even though we had these massive social pushes to make marijuana illegal and to believe it to be dangerous, what we have found over the last couple of years is that public opinion is shifting. So in this graph, we can see a longitudinal measurement of whether people think that marijuana should be made legal. And essentially what we're measuring here is a tidal change in social opinion. It goes from 84% believing that it should be illegal to 67% believing that it should be legal. Essentially, there was a major shift, and Americans just sort of all changed their minds at once. What happened after Americans changed their minds about whether or not it should be legal was that states started changing their laws. So once again, we end up with a sort of a chicken-egg situation. On the one hand, people thought it should be legal. On the other hand, people watched it be legal and noticed that nothing bad happened. So once Colorado started the trend in 2012, a lot of other states got on board. So in this next map, what we're looking at is all of the states where marijuana is either legal for medical use, recreational and medical, or straight out illegal. One of the things that you'll notice here is that the places where marijuana is still illegal tend to be places that are generally socially conservative. This is something that we've seen over and over so far, and something that we're going to continue to see. The states where it's both recreational and medical are states that do tend to lean blue, if you will. They tend to be rather democratic, they tend to be rather socially liberal. But one of the most interesting things about this is how quickly these things are changing. It's only been 8 years, but we've already seen a lot of states get on board with the legalization issue. This next graph is measuring arrests for marijuana. And this graph is interesting for 2 reasons. First, we see a spike right after marijuana became a Schedule I drug, of course, in the early 70s. But second, we see another spike in the early 90s. And what happened here was entirely political. Basically, some people were trying to get elected. Those people were Bill Clinton. No, but some people were trying to get elected, and one of the ways that they did this was by enforcing drug laws. It's a great thing when you're trying to make campaign speeches. People love to hear that you're going to crack down on drug use. And so one of the things that we saw was an increased number of police and increased arrests that those police did based on marijuana. All of those arrests took place in a very specific part of the population. This next slide will not surprise you. So in this graph, we're looking at the racial disparities in regard to marijuana arrests. These are measuring specifically possession and not necessarily distribution. But what we're looking at is the extent to which people of color, specifically black people in this graph, are arrested more than people who are essentially white. But what we're looking at is the degree to which black people are arrested more than any other race for possession of marijuana. So this graph ranges from roughly the same, 0 times, up to 10 times. And as you can see, there's more than one state in which black people are arrested at 10 times the rate of white people. If you think back to the graph that we saw earlier about the people who use marijuana, you might recall that white people tend to use it more than black people. But if you look at this graph, you'll notice that black people tend to get arrested at often 5 times the rate, but sometimes 10 times the rate of white people. This is one of the ways that we know that this is sociological. Again, if these things were evenly distributed, we would see that equal numbers of people across the races would be arrested in regard to how much they also use. The fact that there's an enormous disparity in regard to race tells us that there's something social going on. In this next graph, what we're measuring is the amount of arrests that are due to marijuana versus other drugs out of all total drug arrests. So, if we look at this graph, what we can see is that in 2018, about 4 in 10 of the total drug arrests made in America were made on behalf of marijuana. The vast majority of those were possession. So again, we're spending an extraordinary amount of time arresting people for having a very small amount of a largely non-dangerous drug. If we look at this graph once again, we see that heroin and cocaine and the other opiates account for only 1/4 of drug arrests, even though we know that they're killing hundreds and hundreds of people every day. So again, this is how we know that this is a social issue and not a health issue. Our final question is, of course, my favorite, which is it socially acceptable? And the answer to this one is increasingly yes. Again, for years and years, this was something that people did on the down low. And for one thing, it was illegal, but also it was considered something that was only done by a certain segment of the population, and that segment of the population was undesirable. What we're seeing since marijuana became legal, especially in terms of recreational use, is that more and more people are using it, and specifically more and more people are using it openly. In the olden days, we had posters like this that suggest that marijuana was the devil's harness, or that we should just say no. But in modern days, we have festivals like this, where thousands and thousands of people get together to openly smoke and consume marijuana, and it's totally socially acceptable and it's totally legal. If you're having a special event coming up in a state where marijuana is legal, you could hire your very own weed sommelier who might make you a special blend that you can give out as party favors for your guest. In this graph, we're measuring how likely people are to do marijuana together. And this, again, is very important. We talked about the social aspects of alcohol and how we often expect to see it at parties, and we know that often drinking alone is a sign of a problem. Similarly, very often people smoke marijuana together. It tends to be a really social event. It tends to be something that people come together to do. So in this graph, we're measuring how likely people are to use marijuana alone or with other people. And we're also measuring that against how likely they are to say it's socially acceptable. So as you can see, the majority of people use it with other people, often with a spouse or a partner, and the majority of people say that it's socially acceptable. But remember, this data is very recent, and it's likely from a state where it's legal. So overall, is marijuana socially acceptable? It depends on where and when you are, but increasingly, it's becoming one of America's favorite recreational drugs.